TV Spotlight. Person of Interest. Person of Interest is the name of an American science fiction action thriller series that ran for 5 seasons from 2011 to 2016. It starred Jim Caviezel, previously best known as Jesus Christ, as ex-CIA operative John Reese. Reese has left the agency, and indeed his superiors believe him dead, but when the series begins he's effectively living as a homeless person in New York. He ends up being recruited by a mysterious tech billionaire called Harold Finch, played by Michael Emerson, probably still best known as the despicable Benjamin Linus on the cult 2000s fantasy series Lost. Finch has created what is essentially an AI surveillance system on the behest of the US government that effectively monitors all communications throughout the country in order to determine terrorist threats. However, the machine does more than detect terrorist threats. It also detects threats against ordinary individual citizens. While the US government has decreed these statistics to be essentially irrelevant, over time the irrelevant list begins to haunt Finch, and he ultimately employs Reese as essentially his strong-arm man to get involved, find out whether these individuals that have been flagged are victims or perpetrators of some crime, and stop innocent people from being killed. Also starring in the series when it first begins are Taraji P. Henson as Detective Joss Carter. Carter is a straight-down-the-line NYPD detective who initially begins hunting for Reese when she realizes that he is this mysterious man-in-a-suit vigilante that seems to be on the streets of the city. However, ultimately Carter joins Team Finch and becomes part of the team working from the inside. Another NYPD detective who is part of the regular cast is Lionel Fusco, played by Kevin Chapman. Fusco is a very different character from Carter. In fact, when the series begins, he's effectively a corrupt officer working as part of a corrupt organization known as HR, which effectively not only part of the NYPD, but has its tentacles reaching up all the way into City Hall. However, Fusco is not a bad guy. He's just a guy who's fallen in with very much the wrong crowd, got himself in over his head, and doesn't know how to get out of it. Getting involved with Reese and with Finch ultimately gives him the opportunity to escape from that trap and find his self-esteem and self-respect again by doing good. As the series progresses, 2 new regular characters will be added to the roster. One of them is Samantha Groves, aka Root, a brilliant hacker who becomes aware of and obsessed with the existence of the machine. Initially a dangerous antagonist, Root ultimately becomes again a powerful ally. She is played by Amy Acker, probably previously best known as Fred from the Buffy spin-off series Angel. Another regular character added in later seasons is Samin Shaw, played by Sarah Shahi, a former CIA operative who gets on the wrong side of her former CIA bosses after her partner begins to ask too many questions as to the accuracy of the intel that they receive. Person of Interest essentially begins as sort of like a case of the week action thriller show that just has a very high concept kind of science fiction MacGuffin behind it. However, it becomes clear that the creators of the show have more lofty goals in mind. Towards the end of the first season, and certainly increasingly in season 2, the nature of the machine starts to become much more in question as to exactly how much of an artificial intelligence it is and just how much of a thinking entity it is. These questions become much more apparent and much more dangerous in the show's 3rd season. It's kind of ironic that the show lasted 5 seasons. It wasn't planned as 5 seasons, although it did get a proper ending, thankfully. But it's ironic that it did last 5 seasons because it gives the show a feeling of a show with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Because the midpoint of season 3 really flips the switch in terms of the show's drama and in terms of its focus. Following a series-shaking set of episodes that would be worthy of a series finale, dealing with the final takedown of the corrupt HR organization, the series shifts focus as a much different and arguably even greater threat begins to emerge from the shadows. That threat is not the machine, but it is another artificial intelligence known as Samaritan. This artificial intelligence has been created by somebody who, not a bad guy himself, has not had the ethical constraints that Finch has gone to great lengths to put into his machine. And Samaritan is essentially suggested as something that could be very dangerous, particularly if it falls into the wrong hands. And at the close of season 3, it very much falls into the wrong hands. The alarming thing about those wrong hands is not so much that they want to use the AI for their own nefarious purposes, as that they, much as Root does with Howell's machine, they essentially view it as a form of higher intelligence than humanity, and are basically happy to go along with whatever it says and wants in order to reorganize humanity to its own wishes. The show effectively becomes, in its final 2 seasons, a fight for the future of the human race. Something you could probably not have predicted from watching the first couple of episodes back in season 1. Person of Interest is a brilliant science fiction action thriller series with some wonderful characters and actors. It's probably my second favourite show of the 2010s, and it's certainly my favourite science fiction show. The only show I would put above it would be the excellent Elementary, which is just a detective show and not a genre show. But this is very much a genre show, and more as it goes on. As with Elementary, I didn't really get into Person of Interest at first. I wasn't even aware of its existence. I became aware of it basically because I think my mum watched it. I was like, from the glimpses I saw of it, the very few glimpses, it just looked like a crime show, and like NCIS or any of these other things that are a dime a dozen or were anyway. And even though it had the wonderful Michael Emerson in, who I've been a fan of ever since I saw him in his Emmy-winning guest stint as a serial killer on The Practice back in 2000, it still kind of looked a bit plus which, by the time I became aware of its existence, it had already been on, so it's like, I'm not going to start watching it on TV when it's been on for God knows how long. But I began to hear things, in the genre community about Person of Interest, which began to pique my interest. The presence of Michael Emerson, the fact that, I heard later on that Amy Acker came into it. I'm like, you know what? I'll give this a shot. And I as with kind of Elementary, I rented from the library. I actually kind of picked up the DVD stuff season 1 cheap off of eBay. It cost like $20 or something. I thought, okay, I'll give this a chance. This was about 2015, so I was well behind the curve. And I picked up the first season, really liked it. Picked up the later ones, and it only gets better. It only gets better. Season 1 is probably the weakest season. It's still a good season. It's still a compulsive, enjoyable watch. But it only gets better from there as the main plots really start to shift into gear, and it becomes less of a case of the week and more of an epic saga in its own right. So yeah, I'm watching Person of Interest again just at the moment for like the 3rd time, I think. I've just finished season 1 and just started season 2 again, and great stuff. Yeah, I love Person of Interest. It's a terrific science fiction show that gets a great build-up and a great climax, and doesn't end on a cliffhanger. Thankfully, we get a proper resolution. Thankfully, and as a fan of Michael Emerson, it's a nice change to see him as the good guy for a change. Because previously, all I've ever seen him as is absolute scumbags, which he does a great job with. But he actually gets to be kind and sweet and heroic and eccentric in Person of Interest as a very different character, and he's just as good as that as he is playing a bad guy. I really, really recommend Person of Interest. If you've not heard of it, or heard of it but not seen it, not entirely clear as to what it is, I hope this has given you some clarification on that, and I hope you're inspired to watch it, because For my money, one of the best shows of the 2010s and the best sci-fi fantasy show.